if as others join, they can hear it later. Well, welcome. We're talking today. Thank you for joining us today on a nice Friday morning. We're going to talk about the 2020 election results and what they mean for nonprofits. You've probably heard something about the 2020 election. You might have even voted in it. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So first, I think most of you are familiar with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. I should introduce myself. I'm David Heinen. I'm our Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. We are a network for nonprofits across the state, serving nonprofits in all 100 counties of North Carolina. We're an information resource. We do training and technical assistance for nonprofits on a wide variety of topics: finances, fundraising, things that don't start with the letter F, technology, equity, diversity and inclusion, advocacy, legal compliance, lots and lots of stuff. So many educational resources we provide. We're also an advocate for the North Carolina's nonprofit sector. We're going to talk some about some of what that advocacy might look like for nonprofits moving forward today. So we advocate on state and federal issues that affect all or most 501c3 nonprofits. And we also help nonprofits be advocates for their own mission. And the center's big event for the year is coming up in just a few weeks. Our 2020 annual conference. I know many of you, just looking at who all's on here today, many of you have been to our conference before in person. It's going to, obviously, like every conference has been in 2020 since about the middle of March. Our conference will be a little bit different this year because it will be an online conference, but I think there's still a lot of great opportunities at our conference. So if you haven't registered yet, it's December 8th through 10th, and there are a variety of options for registering for a day or for the full 3 days or for any kind of combination of that. So check it out. If you go to our website, it's easy to find the conference. ncnonprofits.org is our website, and encourage everybody to check that out. It's a great opportunity to connect and also to learn and hopefully to get energized moving into 2021. A couple important disclaimers that I do encourage people to type their answers into the chat. If there's anything where there's a legal question, the center doesn't give legal advice. So any answer I give is, I can tell you what the law is, but I can't apply it to your organization. And secondly, if there's a yes or no legal question, the answer is probably going to be, it depends. So with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about what we will be talking about. Kind of 4 things we're going to cover today. First, the results of the 2020 election. And again, I think that this is probably not news to most people who are on here today, but just want to highlight that because there are a couple takeaways from the results for nonprofits to know. Secondly, what to expect in 2021 and beyond as far as major policy issues, what's going to happen at the federal and the state level. On really kind of big picture issues. And then thirdly, what are some policy solutions for nonprofits in particular? So not just kind of those big picture policy issues, but some things that probably are going to affect your organizations on the policy front post-election. And then finally, just kind of briefly, just 4 next steps that I think every nonprofit should be taking after the election. Kind of common sense things, I think, but important things nonetheless. So I'm going to start with results of the election and want to talk about what happened in North Carolina first. I'll mention what happened at the national level as well, but want to focus more on North Carolina results. At the state level, you see the faces here of Tim Moore with the glasses on the left. On the other side of the legislative building, that's that building there, the legislative building on Jones Street in downtown Raleigh, is Phil Berger with the very faint beard on the right. He is the president pro tem of the North Carolina Senate. Tim Moore is the speaker of the North Carolina House. And at the bottom is Roy Cooper, who's our governor. All of them will still be in those positions next year. They've been for the last 4 years for Governor Cooper, for longer for Speaker Moore and Senator Berger have been leading the legislative chambers. So the big picture dynamics of leadership and the partisan dynamics in Raleigh aren't changing at all after the election. In the state Senate, there'll be 28 Republicans and 22 Democrats in the state Senate. Right now, there are 29 Republicans and 21 Democrats, so not a lot of change in the partisan makeup, but there are 12 new-ish faces, and I say new-ish rather than new faces because there are a few new state senators who've been in the state House, and there is a state senator who who had been a state senator previously, but lost in 2018, won in 2020. So, a lot of people can't give up on politics and keep coming back. So the state Senate is going to be pretty much the same as it was in the last couple of years. The state House of Representatives, there will be a few more. The Republican Party will still have a majority. There'll be 69 Republicans, 51 Democrats. So a few more Republicans next year than there were this year. 22 newish faces. And again, there are a few people who had lost in 2018 who won this time in a rematch. And so a few of those new faces are people who've been in the House of Representatives before. And there's actually one representative in Western North Carolina who had been in the legislature about 6 years ago, who moved to a different part of Western North Carolina, ran for a new district, and is back in the General Assembly. So, not a ton of change at the state legislative level. The one thing to note is that in both the House and the Senate, while the Republicans have a majority, they don't have a big enough of a majority to be able to override vetoes by Governor Cooper. Obviously, Governor Cooper is a Democrat, and on a lot of major policy issues over the last couple of years, he has vetoed, actually over the last 4 years, he's vetoed legislation that Republican majorities in the legislature have passed. For the last 2 years, Republicans have generally not been able to override his veto because on a party line vote, they don't have enough, the 60% supermajority that's required to do that. And that'll continue next year. So that dynamic is going to be very much the same. As far as state level offices, there was not a ton of change. There were 3 new members of the Council of State, which are the statewide positions. There are 10 people on the Council of State who work with the governor to head up the executive branch of the government. All 3 of these newly elected people, so Lieutenant Governor-elect Mark Robinson, Josh Dobson, who's a current legislator from McDowell County, who'll be Commissioner of Labor, and Catherine Truitt, who'll be Superintendent of Public Instruction. We're running for open seats. They're all 3 Republicans, and they're replacing incumbent Republicans. So no partisan change, but there are new faces. So I put those faces up there, just so you can see the smiling faces of our 3 new members of the Council of State. As far as federal elections in North Carolina, so you probably saw this at the top of your ballot. Again, I don't think any of this is going to be a big surprise to anybody. Donald Trump is going to receive North Carolina's 15 electoral votes. Senator Thom Tillis was reelected to represent North Carolina for the next 6 years in the Senate, U.S. Senate. He's a Republican. And 10 of our 13 members of the U.S. House of Representatives were reelected. And those were the only 10 who were running for reelection. We have 1 vacant seat right now in Western North Carolina, and 2 of the incumbents didn't run for reelection. Their districts were changed pretty significantly. So our 3 new members of Congress this year and next year will be Deborah Ross, who is a longtime former state legislator from Raleigh, representing the 2nd district. She's a Democrat. Kathy Manning, who is from the Greensboro area, who will represent the 6th district in Congress. She has a lot of background in board service for nonprofits. Both Deborah Ross and Kathy Manning are attorneys. Deborah Ross was the bill sponsor for many, many nonprofit bills, both the things that the center worked on, but also a lot of things that other nonprofits worked on when she was in the legislature. So she has a lot of experience with nonprofits as well. And then our 3rd member of Congress is Madison Cawthorn, who will be the youngest member. He's 25 years old, will be the youngest member of Congress next year, serving the 11th district in Western North Carolina, and he's a Republican. So he's kind of new to politics, not unfamiliar with social media, apparently. He's very active and sometimes controversial on social media. As far as judicial elections, and again, for presuming everybody who's participating in this webinar probably voted in the election, so you probably saw these things on there. And the state Supreme Court, Republicans, there were 3 Supreme Court justice out of the 7 Supreme Court positions were on the ballot. 3 of them were on the ballot. Republicans won 2 associate justice positions. The election for Chief Justice between Sherry Beasley, who's the incumbent Democrat, the first Black woman to serve as a Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, and Paul Newby, who's a current Associate Justice on the Supreme Court, a Republican, was extremely close. There were only 408 votes separating the two of them out of 5.4 million votes, which is, I believe, talking to people in other states, I think the closest statewide race that there's been in the country, and one of the closest statewide races has been in the country in a very long time. So there's a recount for that now, and it is not certain that Justice Newby will win the recount. 408 votes is definitely enough that it could easily flip. For those of you who were following that last weekend and end of last week, over the weekend, and then on Monday, it was really back and forth as the last few county absentee ballots and provisional ballots were trickling in between the 2 of them. So that is still up for grabs. Regardless, the Democratic Party will still have a majority on the Supreme Court, either 5 to 2 or 4 to 3. And I hate saying that, actually, not that not hating, or liking which party has control. It's unfortunate that we have partisan court elections in North Carolina, because the judicial branch traditionally is one that is very nonpartisan and is not taking partisan politics, but it is what it is. On the State Court of Appeals, there were several judges up for election. Republicans won all of those seats. The Republicans now have a majority on the State Court of Appeals. The courts matter, and again, hopefully the partisan makeup of the courts doesn't matter, but who is on the court does often matter to nonprofits, because the reality is sometimes if there are legislative actions or problems with the executive branch that nonprofits experience, they wind up going through the state court system. And the decisions of the Court of Appeals and the North Carolina Supreme Court often play a really big role for things like criminal justice matters, for a lot of education issues, for environmental issues. So the court system is very, very important. At the national level, as far as election results, as you can see, the current president, I think, as we all know, is portrayed by Alec Baldwin on Saturday Night Live, and he will now be replaced by somebody portrayed by Jim Carrey on Saturday Night Live. Those are not the actual pictures of Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So, oh, good, we got a laugh. Even laughing out loud. 2 laughs, good. I'm glad that people appreciate the images from Saturday Night Live. I do want to just kind of highlight the dynamics in Congress. On the left, you see, and I think everybody recognizes her, Speaker Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi from California. Democrats will still have a majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. It'll be less than it was before. Joe Biden, of course, will be president starting January 20th of 2021. And Kamala Harris will be vice president. Significant, obviously, historically, because our first woman vice president, our first Asian American vice president, and our first African American vice president. So a lot of firsts, and Kamala Harris being vice president. I also kind of put her next to kind of near Mitch McConnell in the Senate. The current makeup of the Senate for 2021, the US Senate, is 50 Republicans and 48 Democrats or independents who would caucus with Democrats. That's significant because, as most of you are probably aware, there are as a runoff election at the beginning of January in Georgia for both of the Senate seats there. And if Republicans win either or both of those seats, then Mitch McConnell will remain the majority leader in the Senate, and the Republican Party will control the US Senate. But if Democrats were to win both of those runoff elections, then it would be a 50-50 split, and Kamala Harris would be particularly significant because she would move from being a senator from California to the tie-breaking vote in the Senate as vice president, and Democrats would have a majority in the Senate. So Chuck Schumer, who is pictured a little bit smaller there from New York, would be the Senate majority leader. presuming that the Republicans maintain the Senate, there's going to be gridlock again in Washington. But even if it is a 50-50 split, it is likely that it's not going to be real simple for things to pass along partisan lines in Washington over the next couple of years. So regardless of how you felt about any of those faces you just saw, any of the names, any of the numbers you just saw about individual election results, I think there's one thing that all of us as nonprofits and all of us as North Carolinians should really celebrate about the election. And that is that we had a record voter turnout. More than 3/4 of registered voters in North Carolina turned out. And a lot of that was because of the nonpartisan work that nonprofits did for voter registration, get out the vote work, and voter education. So give yourselves an applause for that. I wanted to ask pause for a moment and ask 2 poll questions. So Sarah, if you can put up the first question. There we go, we see it. And you can answer more than one of these. So the question is really, do you know personally? And when I say know personally, that means could you text or call on their cell phone or knock on their door? And you're not gonna actually like go up to them and go into their house right now, I would hope, but knock on their door and run away and wave from a safe social distance to them, and they'd know who you are, or send them a message on Facebook or some other social media platform, or send them an email, or have some way of contacting them, somebody personally, any member of Congress, a state legislator, a council of state member, a new county board member, or none of the above. So if you want to just fill that in, you can click all of them. Don't click all and none of the above, but click any that you know, just to get a sense of what we know. So I'll give it a minute. I cannot see the what's going on in the poll, so I'm kind of running blind on this. So I'm going to ask Sarah to give us. Now I can see it though. So 2/3 of you don't know any of them, but a quarter of you do know a county board member. 15% know a state legislator. 7% know a member of Congress. 7% know a council state member. And feel free to and a lot of people know a lot of people who didn't win, I see in the chat. You're welcome if you'd like to type into the chat who you know, particularly members of Congress, state legislators, city council, state members. You don't have to, but if you want to type them in, kind of good to know who are some familiar faces in there. I see Harry Warren, who's from Rowan County, good, House member. And while we're doing that, we're going to put up one more poll too, related to the voter turnout. Amos Quick from Guilford County, good, another House member. So we should have another poll coming up momentarily. Hey, and just a reminder, good point that Jolie put into the chat. But if you're putting into the chat, you're welcome to just respond to panelists. But it'd be great to respond to panelists and attendees if you're willing, because that way everybody can see what you're sharing. So some people know quite a few members. The other question we wanted to ask is whether your nonprofit did anything to promote voter education, voter registration, people getting out to vote this year. So a few options, and again, click as many as are applicable. One of the big ones that the center was really encouraging nonprofits to do is making sure you're giving staff time off to vote this year, sharing nonpartisan information about the election, voter registration work, or get out the vote work. So I'll give everybody a minute to do that. And once we can see the results of that poll, we'll give everybody a round of applause. Well, that's great that the majority of you did something related to the election, which is great. And I think that really helped contribute to this record voter turnout in North Carolina. A lot of people gave staff time off to vote, which is really important. And a lot shared nonpartisan information about the election. So thank you all for the great work you've done on that. So we're going to move past the election now and kind of talk about what it means. And first, I want to just quickly highlight nonprofits' needs. And that I think that it's not a surprise to anybody that COVID is still here. It's going to be with us for a while. Hopefully not too much longer, but for at least for the first part of 2021, it's going to be a reality, and it's really going to shape a lot of the operations of our organizations, our finances, but also a lot of the policy discussion and hopefully policy solutions. So I wanted to just highlight a few results from a survey, and I know that many of you participated in the survey that the center did in partnership with the North Carolina Office of Strategic Partnerships and the Governor's Office. More than 2,000 people working for nonprofits responded to it. And yeah, no surprise, most nonprofits operations have been impacted by COVID, and 3/4 of organizations have had some type of disruption in their programs and services. Interestingly, that during the first part of the pandemic, there actually, a majority of nonprofits didn't see an increase in demand for services, but more were anticipating that was going to change and that there was going to be an increase in demand for services in the second half of 2020. So I think that more nonprofits are seeing greater need now. And, some of that is just as people's lives, they've adapted, and they kind of, more people, more organizations, more communities really know now what they need. We have a little bit better clarity about what we should be doing, what our needs are than maybe we did in March and April. So I think that's part of that. And it really varied depending on types of organizations. There were some direct service organizations where, they're providing food assistance, housing assistance, help for people who are out of work that saw a skyrocketing increase in demand, and other types like some educational organizations, arts organizations didn't see as much increase in demand for services. One of the big things that really struck me from the survey was that average employment in the nonprofit sector dropped pretty precipitously from the survey. And there are a variety of ways to measure this, but the average number of employees of respondents was cut nearly in half. And a lot of organizations were expecting to have to do more furloughing or more layoffs in the second half of the year. So it's not necessarily getting better. But also, and that's true in the business sector too, but in one of the big challenges for nonprofits, and I suspect for a lot of your organizations, just seeing who all's on here today, that is that we often rely on volunteers a lot, and there's been a huge drop off in volunteers as people have been less able to do things in person. And as many of the types of volunteer opportunities that are out there for people to help out with nonprofits just aren't really doable right now. And also a significant portion of volunteers of nonprofits are older North Carolinians who are at higher risk for COVID, and for very good reason, don't want, really want to isolate themselves to the greatest degree possible. So another poll question we're going to put up is whether your nonprofits had a reduction in staff or number of volunteers. And again, you can put both during the pandemic, so since March. So I'll give people a moment to put that up. And once we see the results from that, we will continue. Well, that's great that only a quarter, not great that a quarter of you have had a reduction in staff, but that 25% is a lot lower than the overall percentage of nonprofits that have had a reduction in staff. And more than half people on the webinar today have had a reduction in number of volunteers. Again, not a huge surprise, but still, not good news. The other big thing, and again, I suspect this is true for most nonprofits, and we've got to, because we have to do a poll question for everything. Now, this will be our penultimate poll question of the day, I believe. That 3/4 of nonprofits had revenue losses during the first 3 months of the pandemic, and 80% expected even further revenue losses during the second half of the year. So poll question, not just whether you had a revenue loss, but curious if since March, if you've had a reduction in revenue from different sources, and you can read just as well as I can say it. So I'll be quiet for a moment while you read the options on the poll, and we'll see what the results are. And while you're filling that, just want to, since it was only to panelists, I won't identify who it was, but except to say that it's somebody who always has good insights, noted that there is a difference between a reduction in volunteers and a reduction in the number functioning in the same way. And that's a great point that, and that's a nuance that was neither in the survey nor in that, that polling question I just did. So excellent point on that, you know, it probably would be helpful to know a little bit more about what that loss of volunteers has meant. So a lot of organizations have had drops in fundraising event revenue. Makes sense because those have had to really change significantly. And a lot of drops in individual and corporate donations, interesting. So foundation grants and government grants and contracts, not as much. Well, thank you to everybody for filling out those. And now we're going to talk about some major policy issues in 2021 and beyond. And I just want to note that I don't know how to read a calendar. So by 2021 and beyond, I mean November 21st, 2020 and beyond, and probably December 20th, December 2020 and beyond, because some of these might actually be addressed in the rest of this year, at least the federal issues. So kind of some priorities in Washington. No surprise, but the biggest priority, even though it seems like that the Speaker Pelosi, Senator McConnell, and President Trump can't get on the same page on this, COVID relief is clearly the top priority for policymakers in Washington. So, you know, a few things to look for in 2021. You know, and again, not trying to be partisan, but just being realistic, is that, you know, I suspect that starting January 20th, that there's going to be more of a, and I know that there's a lot of traction on this already, more of a clear and consistent national policy on preventative measures for COVID, testing, tracing, and vaccination and distribution of vaccines as they become available. You know, it is the Trump administration has largely left that to states and local governments to do on their own, and is not really led with a, you know, kind of a national approach to that. And, you know, probably that is, you know, unfortunately, you know, has had a lot of, you know, maybe we haven't reduced the spread and the number of fatalities as much as possible. So that you know, that's one thing. That's not one that the Congress will be involved in some of that, particularly with funding for testing and tracing, and perhaps with funding for vaccination distribution. But that's definitely one that you know, that the White House will take the lead in. Additional tax relief for individuals. So as probably many of you know, you received that that stimulus check over the summer, or most Americans received that stimulus check over the summer. There's a lot of talk about a second round of that, you know, either at the end of this year or at this point, probably won't come until early 2021. One of the big challenges when, you know, nobody knew exactly how long COVID was going to last, you know, how things would play out. So a lot of the provisions in the CARES Act that was passed over the summer and in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that was passed in the spring were time limited and expire December 30th, 2020. And one of the big parts of that is the additional unemployment relief for individuals. So, yeah, as I think many of us know, that people who are out of work get some supplemental benefits from the federal government. Those $600 payments went away, but the White House, you know, temporarily provided some $300 payments supplementing state unemployment benefits, but also people who are out of work who wouldn't get unemployment coverage, people who are self-employed and are out of work, people who work for a religious nonprofit or a nonprofit with 3 or fewer employees who wouldn't normally get unemployment benefits if they're laid off or furloughed. They are also getting those unemployment benefits. So that all, and there are other ways of kind of streamlining unemployment and getting people better and longer benefits. That all expires at the end of this year. The challenge is there are a lot of people who are going to lose their unemployment benefits at the beginning of 2021 without action from Congress. Again, when the CARES Act was passed, I think that the thinking was that, we're pretty sure that the COVID is going to be with us for 2020, but maybe it'll magically disappear, in the words of somebody, once the calendar turns to 2021. And we all know now that's not going to happen. So that's a real need. I don't think that there are many in Congress who disagree with that needs to be extended. It's just a matter of getting an agreement on an overall package. One thing where there is some disagreement in Congress is limitation of liability for businesses and nonprofits. That is a key priority for Senator McConnell, to making sure that, and we have this at the state level. So the General Assembly passed legislation that says that as a nonprofit or as a business, as long as you're taking very basic precautions and letting people know what you're doing, that if somebody thinks that they got COVID at your event or coming into your facility or when you're providing services, that you're not going to be liable for their getting COVID. So that's something that Congress is looking at. The U.S. House has some concerns about that, and that it might, not allowing for workers' comp for people who get it through their employment. So I think that's one that's still going to need some negotiation. And then also additional funding for PPE, for tracking, for tracing, also for vaccination distribution. So those are all some of the big picture things Congress is looking at. I'll mention some nonprofit parts of that in a moment, or in a few moments, actually. Some other congressional priorities, the federal budget, the Congress for the last several years has operated under a plan of let's not pass the budget, but let's do a continuing resolution to keep the federal government funded. And they've had a few shutdowns in recent years. The next shutdown is scheduled for December 11th. It looks like, but it's not guaranteed, that the White House was signaling yesterday that they are willing to sign an appropriations bill that's negotiated between the House and the Senate. And it looks like the House and Senate are working on a bipartisan way to fund the federal government. So that'll probably happen in early December, but it's not a guarantee. And that would be for the rest of the current fiscal year through September 30th of 2021. The other kind of big picture thing, as I mentioned, there have been a lot of shutdowns. There has been thinking, and it's kind of a bipartisan thing, that the current budget process in Washington doesn't really work. So that might be something where there might be a bipartisan solution, not this year, but next year, as far as a procedural way to make sure that the government doesn't continue to shut down and for a few days, and that there aren't disruptions in major services simply because the two parties in Washington can't get along. And as the parties become more and more polarized, and if there continues to be a different party in leadership of the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, that's a concern that's going to get out there. But I think almost everybody agrees that a government shutdown is not or even threatening one isn't really a good policy for communities and for people. So, look at that as something that might happen. The reality is, again, with likely different parties in control of the House and Senate in Washington, or even if Democrats control both but have the same number of votes as Republicans in the U.S. Senate and a very slim majority in the House, it's likely that things aren't going to just pass smoothly, but there is going to continue to be gridlock, and it's going to be very difficult to pass major legislation. And that means that probably no major changes in healthcare policy. It will depend on what the U.S. Supreme Court decides on the recent case that they heard on the Affordable Care Act. I think given the discussion there, it sounds like it is unlikely that the court will strike down the ACA in whole, but there might be some parts of the ACA that are found to be unconstitutional and that may need to be tweaked. But I don't think that over the next couple of years that there's likely to be major changes in healthcare policy. So things like Medicare, Medicare for all, probably not on the table. Things like repealing the Affordable Care Act, probably not on the table either. So, no significant changes. Probably no major legislative changes for environmental policy, and perhaps not a lot of additional funding for environmental action as well. Again, it's difficult to, for that to pass. So things like the Green New Deal that have been talked about by some progressives in Washington, probably not on the table for the next couple of years, just with the makeup of Congress. Major tax policy changes, as probably most of you know, in end of 2017, Congress passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was one of the bigger changes to the federal tax code in recent years. It's unlikely that there are going to be other significant tax changes, either bringing in more revenue through, raising taxes on upper income people, or other big tax cuts, or other major tax omnibus changes happening. Again, because those tend to be things that happen when one party can kind of control the entire system. And also, the reality is that, clearly that there is a need for a wide range of policy changes to address systemic racism in our country. I think it's going to be challenging to make a lot of progress on those, when there are many in Washington who are still uncomfortable with that concept, or unaccepting of the reality that there is systemic racism that's been at play in our country for so long, and that that's leading to so many problems in communities. So, unfortunately, I think that there will be a lot of talk about that. There will be a lot of bills filed to, in many different areas to try to address that, in criminal justice policy and tax policy, in providing support for communities, and particularly communities of color. But I don't know that that ultimately a lot of that's going to lead to successful action. One thing that will change significantly, though, in January 2020, President Trump, following President Obama, had done a lot by executive action, and that is clearly going to change. And particularly, 4 areas. I'm going to mention one other area when we talk about nonprofit specific. Actually, 2 other areas. But President-elect Biden already has his legal team working on a good number of executive orders that will be issued as soon as January 20th of 2021, undoing a lot of the deregulation of environmental measures that the Trump administration has done in a wide variety of areas. Really making significant changes to immigration policy. I think kind of undoing a lot of, both what the Trump administration had done, but even what the Obama administration had done, which was very aggressive in deportation and immigration enforcement. President-elect Biden has certainly signaled that he is a lot more open to friendlier immigration policy, and that a lot of that can be done through executive action. So look for a lot there. Healthcare policy, to the extent that the President Trump has rolled back parts of the Affordable Care Act, or enforcement of things, or created barriers to healthcare delivery through executive action. Look for the Biden administration to undo those, and to do what they can to increase access, and kind of get at the intent of the Affordable Care Act. Obviously, as Vice President, Joe Biden was very engaged in the passage of the Affordable Care Act. So, that'll be something that will be a priority for the administration. And U.S. Department of Labor policies, things like the minimum wage. The Biden administration is interested in. That is something that is in statute, but there are ways to kind of bring up the minimum wage de facto through executive action, through changes and exemptions to the Fair Labor Standards Act that the Obama administration tried to do. The Trump administration kind of took a different approach. As far as identifying which types of workers are independent contractors or employees, so who all gets benefits for their work and what employers pay. These aren't ones where there's necessarily a uniform position among nonprofits, but they're going to affect your operations a lot. So if you get our policy updates on Friday, which you probably do, we'll keep tracking those and let you know. And if there is some uniformity in the nonprofit sector, the center will certainly take the lead in sending comments or taking action as appropriate on those. But just know that those are some big changes. Education policy will almost certainly change too quite a bit under the Biden administration. Big picture priorities in Raleigh. I think that the biggest discussion, state budget is always the biggest thing that the state legislature does in a two-year session, particularly in their long session, which is the year after an election. So next year will be their long session starting in January. I think it's going to take on even greater precedence next year because there's a significant shortfall in state revenue. $4 or $5 billion out of a $20 to $25 billion budget are likely to be missing because of revenue drops because of the economic impacts of COVID. That means that under the state constitution, like 48 other states, every state except for Vermont, we have to have a balanced budget in North Carolina. So that means that they're going to need to be either significant cuts to state spending or some new revenue that's going to come about. The majority in the state legislature hasn't been real interested in looking at raising taxes as a new revenue source. And that's really, the main revenue source. So it's unlikely that that there's going to be adequate revenue, barring some aid from the federal government, which is possible, but adequate state revenue to fund, basic state functions. So that's going to be a big challenge. The other challenge will be the budget process. So the last 2 years, Governor Cooper has vetoed the budget, and instead of having a state budget, we've just kind of operated on the previous year's budget, and the legislature's tweaked that. That works if the economy is it works to some degree if the economy is pretty good. When there's a big shortfall, it means that there are a lot of funding cuts and maybe not done. It's kind of done in a piecemeal way, so there's not a holistic approach to it. It also makes it hard to adjust for changes in population growth in certain parts of the state, but also just changes in needs for state functions and state programs in different parts of the state. So I do think that's, even if they can't agree with Governor Cooper on a state budget, that'll be a priority. Like at the federal level with gridlock between the governor and the legislature, I would expect that it's going to be very difficult to make significant changes to healthcare policy. Clearly Medicaid expansion will be Governor Cooper's priority again. I think that's going to be very difficult to see that happening in the next 2 years, but never know. Major environmental policy changes, probably mostly off the table. Tax policy changes, again, difficult to pass on a bipartisan basis. Major changes to state labor and employment laws or criminal justice reforms addressing systemic racism. So again, I think a lot of challenges for that. One of the big other priorities for the legislature next year will be redrawing the maps for the state legislative districts and our congressional districts for the next decade. Nonprofits would obviously benefit from an independent redistricting process. We have gerrymandering right now where districts are drawn to, essentially to keep the majority party in place. That was true when Democrats drew the maps. It's true with Republicans drawing the maps. It is possible, though, that as many of you know, that last year the legislature redrew some of the district maps because of a court order. So it's possible that the process might change from kind of purely a partisan process to one that's more transparent, which is what they did before. So it might have more transparency. It also might involve lottery machines, which is what they used last year. They had a expert college professor come up with 100 different maps, and they used a lottery machine to pick one of them as a starting point for the maps that were drawn. And then the Excel spreadsheets and this is actually a live shot of the redistricting process last year, where several legislative staffers looking very excited were working on Excel spreadsheets. It was broadcast live, and you can see the spreadsheets being manipulated live throughout the day for weeks. Thrilling process, but it does allow the public an opportunity to see what's going on, whereas before the maps were drawn purely behind closed doors. So probably an improvement in the process. And Senator Berger and Speaker Moore have indicated that they want to follow that process again next year. So for nonprofits, a few policy priorities at the federal and state level to highlight. First, COVID relief. I mentioned that this is a big priority for Congress. There are some nonprofit specific things that are a big deal in that. One is extending and expanding the PPP program. Based on our survey, about 45% of North Carolina nonprofits received forgivable PPP loans in the first round, so possibly having a second round of that. Expanding the employee retention tax credit. That's one that nonprofits probably aren't very familiar with because for most, the PPP was a much better option. This was a tax credit that businesses or nonprofits could get if they kept their payroll under the CARES Act, but they couldn't get it if they got PPP loans, and PPP was a much better deal for most. There's talk in Congress of first expanding it significantly, so it'd be a much bigger tax credit, but also allowing nonprofits and businesses that got PPP loans to also get the ERTC. So this could be another source of financial support for nonprofits that have suffered losses during COVID. More emergency funding for nonprofits that are serving vulnerable populations, so affordable housing, food assistance, domestic violence, kind of across the board, things that where nonprofits are providing services to people who are affected by COVID, more federal funding for that. One thing that that I think is unlikely, but is an ask for nonprofits. As we noted that there's been a big loss in volunteers, so maybe some funding to support staffing for nonprofits that have lost volunteers. There was a bill introduced in the U.S. Senate that would do that. The Work Now Act. I don't know how seriously Congress will consider that, but that might be a way to kind of offset some of those losses of volunteers. And three other resources for nonprofits would be strengthening the universal charitable deduction. I saw that was one of the big drop in individual giving was one of the big things that those of you on the webinar noted was something that you've seen as a financial challenge in the last 9 months. So I think that a stronger universal charitable deduction and one that extended into 2021 would be a way to bring in more individual donations for nonprofits during the pandemic. Extending unemployment relief both for individuals like we talked about, but also for nonprofits. So the CARES Act provided 50% coverage for nonprofits that instead of paying unemployment insurance, reimbursed for those claims. And that's a lot of North Carolina nonprofits. The state of North Carolina is picking up the other half. So if your nonprofit doesn't pay unemployment insurance, state unemployment tax, but instead keeps 1% of your payroll in escrow with the Division of Employment Security in North Carolina, and then you reimburse for those claims, you're not going to have to pay anything. And that would be tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of funding for nonprofits. At the center, that was one of our big priorities, was advocating for Congress and the state to hold harmless nonprofits, and they did that. And again, that just goes to the end of 2020. So that needs to be extended into 2021. We think it will, but it's still a big policy ask. And if it weren't, that would be a huge potential liability for nonprofits next year. And then the other big one is providing relief to state and local governments. And I mentioned that the state government is looking at a significant revenue shortfall for next year. Local governments, our counties, our cities, our towns, also will likely have very big revenue shortfalls. That's going to mean big cuts to services, which collectively means the nonprofits are going to need to pick up the slack as far as providing more public services. And also, as state and local governments are looking for revenue, they're going to look at who's not paying taxes, and that is nonprofits that own property. Looking maybe we should get them to pay property tax or to have a mandatory payment in lieu of taxes to bring in more revenue for our counties and our cities and towns. It also would mean that nonprofits, when we're buying things in the state, we can get refunds for the sales tax we pay on that now, possibly eliminating that to bring in more state revenue. Those are bad policy options. We want to prevent that. One easy way to prevent that would be for Congress to allocate more funding in its next relief package for state and local governments. That, unfortunately, is a really contentious issue because Senator McConnell from Kentucky and the leader of the Senate and President Trump are very opposed to that. So depending on whether a COVID relief package is passed this year or in January, that might actually affect how much relief goes to the state and local governments. Especially depending on the outcome of those Georgia Senate elections, because if Democrats control the Senate, there would be a lot of incentive. I think that there'd be a lot of momentum to provide that relief. And then a couple federal executive actions that I would expect that President, and we're certainly asking President-elect Biden to take, hopefully January 20th or soon thereafter, that directly affect nonprofits. As many of you know, and we heard from a lot of nonprofits that this is a really big deal. President Trump issued an executive order that takes effect tomorrow that limits the ability of businesses and nonprofits with federal grants or contracts to provide workplace training on things like equity, diversity, and inclusion, things like implicit bias. And it's really kind of, trying to ferret out those types of workplace trainings by having a hotline for people to call if an organization is doing those trainings. So it doesn't necessarily like preclude you from getting grants, but it would put a new provision in future grants or grant agreements or contracts that you would have to do that. And that's really troubling, as with everything that's happened in the country this summer and in the past, that really focusing on race equity and gender equity are really at the forefront of what nonprofits do. And for many organizations, really existential for what they do. To make sure that their staff, if a nonprofit is providing services in community and color, if it has white people working for it who aren't trained in race equity, they just can't provide a good level of services. For a domestic violence organization that has men working for it that isn't who don't get good training on gender issues, they may not be able to provide a good quality of service. So it's really is an existential thing, and it's a huge issue for nonprofits. So we expect, and we've been in communication already with people who are working with the Biden transition team, that that's going to get repealed as soon as he becomes president next year. Also, 2017, President Trump issued a executive order, which didn't actually do anything, but which he made a big deal about, to enable faith-based nonprofits, he thought, to be more partisan and to speak out. And as many of you know, and you've heard my soapbox issue on this, the Johnson Amendment, or the provision in Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code that says that C3s can't be partisan, is really, really important to nonprofits' credibility, to our ability to operate well, to our ability to provide services in an effective way. So President Trump's tried to undermine that. We think that President-elect Biden will likely repeal that executive order. Again, it didn't really do anything, but it sent a really, I think, troubling message to the nonprofit sector and to Americans. And then some, and actually before we do that, I want to do a quick poll. I know we just have a couple minutes left, but there's one more poll I do want to do on COVID relief. And if you can just take a moment to click on any of these that would be helpful. So I kind of mentioned what some of the things that Congress is looking at as far as COVID relief. And if you want to identify ones that would be helpful for your organization. As we're continuing, the Center's been advocating for all of these, but it's also a lot to be advocating for. So it's always helpful for us to hear what matters most to you. We've heard from various nonprofits that all of them would be helpful, but yeah, you can click all of them, that's fine. But anything that'd be helpful does inform our advocacy. And once we see the results, I will move on. A lot of people want PPP loans, and two-thirds of you want an expansion of the universal charitable deduction. Well, please know we are certainly advocating for those, for both of those, for all of these. When the state legislature comes back in January, and the state legislature is very unlikely to do anything in December, but when they come back in January. They'll probably, depending on what Congress has done, Service Corps has noted grants strictly for operational expenses would be great, but are hard to find. Thank you for those comments in the chat. And we'll track the comments in the chat too, so we will know what all you said in there, so we won't lose those. The state legislature is likely to look at additional state support, maybe some grant programs for businesses and nonprofits. As many of you know, nonprofits got added, and we worked really hard to get this added to a couple of the state grant programs for businesses affected by COVID. Extending unemployment relief to reimbursing nonprofits, as I mentioned, that the state's providing half of that through the end of the year. If Congress fixes the federal half, we'll need to make sure that Governor Cooper continues the state half of that. I think he will. Extension of increased unemployment benefits. So the state legislature, North Carolina's got some of the lowest unemployment benefits in the country. Temporarily bump those up by $50 a week for the rest of 2020 back in September, but that ends at the end of September. And then additional investment in nonprofits providing kind of key services. MER grant, yes, Nate, the MER has emptied out, as many of you know, the mortgage, utilities, and rental reimbursement grant program. Nonprofits got added to that. Restaurants got added to it last week. That's the grant program for businesses that were closed during part of the pandemic. When restaurants got added, that ate up the rest of the funding. So that, as of yesterday or today, is now empty. Other nonprofit sector policy issues, I mentioned with the revenue shortfall that there could be funding cuts to nonprofits and challenges to nonprofit tax exemption. Other things that might come up in the legislative session, accountability on grants to nonprofits. The Program Evaluation Oversight Committee has been looking at over the last few months, and the center's talked with them about this. They'll be having the report next month. Grants to nonprofits that are doing disaster relief work and looking at the process for that. I would expect that there might be recommendations for additional accountability for nonprofits that are doing disaster relief using state funding. The center will be advocating certainly for some improvements to nonprofit statutes, to the Nonprofit Corporation Act, to the Charitable Solicitation Act. If you have specific things and any law that would be helpful, my email, you should be able to find it in many, many ways to our website through hitting reply to our policy updates. It'll be at the end of this PowerPoint too. If you have ideas for anything, we're actively working on a lot of specifics on things. Most notably, if you have members under an executive order from Governor Cooper, your membership meetings can be held remotely during the pandemic. We've heard from a lot of nonprofits that that's been really helpful and attendance has improved. So we're trying to make that a permanent change in the Nonprofit Corporations Act. I'm not going to get into the details of other specifics, but know that a lot more is coming. Thank you, Sarah, for putting my email address in there. So 4 next steps for nonprofits. These are simple things. First, get to know your elected officials. In that first poll we had, a lot of you know people who won, particularly in the county board level and state legislative level, but get to know your new elected officials, even if it's somebody who's won for re-election. Now is a great time to introduce yourself so that they know that your nonprofit is a resource that is working in partnership with them to help your community, because ultimately our elected officials are looking to help our communities just like our organizations are. So you can be a great resource and partner to them. And that way, when there is a policy issue that affects your community and affects your mission and the work you do, you will have that relationship already. So I encourage you to, whether it's just sending a thank you note, to setting up a quick Zoom call with them, or sending them information about your organization, that would be great. Secondly, we talked a lot about gridlock in Washington and Raleigh. There's a lot less gridlock at the local level. Many of the local policies, whether it's local transportation policies, affordable housing policies, decisions that school boards make, decisions county boards make on funding opportunities, those have a huge impact on your organization, on your mission, and on your community. So I would encourage your organization to really focus on advocating at the county level, the city or town level, rather than trying to focus on advocating at the federal and state level only. The reality is you can have more of an impact And it's going to, a lot of the decisions that are made at the local level are going to have a lot more significance for the work you do. Yeah, I'm preaching again on this. And with our second poll question, a lot of you have done this, but I think that prioritizing nonpartisan civic engagement, voter registration, voter education, get out the vote work, and making sure that your staff have time off to vote in future elections, and ideally paid time off to vote in future elections, is really important. It was wonderful that we had record voter turnout this year. It was a highly charged and very, there's a lot of excitement from both sides of the political aisle of people that I think got people out to vote. But nonprofits, nonpartisan work played a huge role in that, and we should congratulate ourselves, but I think build on that too. It should be something that every nonprofit does, and I challenge your nonprofit to find a way to do that if you haven't. And finally, advocate. I mentioned that advocating at the local level is great, but advocating doesn't just mean talking to policymakers and elected officials, but make sure that you're telling your story to others in your community, to business leaders, to the media, making sure that the people who you're serving have the ability to share their own stories and to be self-advocates. There's so many ways nonprofits can be advocates, but I do think that, ultimately, that advocacy is going to strengthen every nonprofit's ability to meet your mission, and look for a lot more tools from the center on this. We are, recognizing that the nonprofits want and need more tools on advocacy, not just like what you can or can't do, which we've provided, but resources on storytelling, on coming up with a strategy on priorities for advocacy. So look for a lot more on that from the center in 2021. And with that, it's in the chat too, but my contact information is up here. And at some point, and if you have other questions, feel free to type those into the chat before we depart. And if not, just, enjoy your lunch. I think we are right at lunchtime. Don't forget to register for our conference at ncnonprofits.org, which you see up there, and have a wonderful weekend and a safe and socially distant Thanksgiving.